We're propagating pelargoniums today on Pots and Trowels, and that's brought to you with the support of Cobra Garden and King Seeds. Hello and welcome to Pots and Trowels. Well, I'm in the greenhouse just doing a bit of pottering around, and here we are now coming towards the end of September, and it certainly feels very autumnal at the moment. In fact, just over a week ago we had our first autumn frost, got down to sort of -1 outside, and even in the greenhouse it got down to 0. So fortunately no damage, but we're getting to the time of the year now when it can start to get cold nights. So in the greenhouse though, as we can see, tomatoes have almost finished. We've still got some fruits. I would think another couple of weeks at the most. We're getting cucumbers, we've got peppers, and the last of the aubergines as well. So we'll get these harvested very soon and dealt with, and then we can clear these crops out and get the greenhouse ready for winter. But what I want to just chat about today very quickly is pelargoniums, because I love the old-fashioned zonal pelargoniums, or what we call the fancy leaved ones as well. And this is a zonal pelargonium. A zonal pelargonium essentially means that on the leaf it has a zone. If it's not a fancy leaf one, it would just be a darker marking around there. But this is one of the fancy leaved ones, which is called a happy thought, that has red flowers, and this one is a lovely variegated one with quite a delicate leaf and lovely pale pink flowers. But as you can see, these have been outside, cooler weather and a bit of rain has sort of brought them to the end of their flowering season, so they're not looking their best. So it's time really to get these ready for the winter and bring them inside. So if you've got any pelargoniums that you want to keep, regardless of what the variety is, I must say these are both old varieties. This one particularly I think is the oldest. This is a Victorian variety. What you can do is give them a trim back, because otherwise they're just going to get taller and taller every year, and they're more difficult to overwinter. So what I'm going to do, using a pair of secateurs, is just give these a haircut. So I'm cutting down always to a little shoot just above a bud if we can. So I'm just going to snip that off, and then I'm going to take this one off here and this one here. So it's basically just giving this a tidy up to keep it nice and bushy and compact. And we'll take that one off there. And then I'm also going to take off all these yellowing leaves, and they can go into the bin down there. And that now is much easier to overwinter than a large straggly plant. And what we need to do with that over the winter is give it somewhere that's frost free. Now I tend to keep them in the greenhouse, and I can just about keep this frost free with just a little bit of heat. But if you haven't got a greenhouse, then if you've got a cool windowsill or a porch or a conservatory where they're getting reasonable light but no frost on them, that is ideal. And the other thing is we allow the compost to almost dry out. Pelargoniums hate being wet over the winter, so they'll stand much cooler temperatures if you allow the compost to almost dry out. And when it feels very dry, just give it a little bit of water just to moisten it, and they will tick over. And what will happen is, from where we've cut these stems back, we'll get nice new shoots in the spring, and then we've got a lovely plant that will carry on next year. So it not only keeps them in better condition, it keeps them nice and bushy as well. Now I'm going to do exactly the same with this one here, which I say is looking quite messy. I'll cut it back, take all this foliage off. But then what do we do with these? Well, this is also the perfect time to take some cuttings. So if you want a few new plants for free, this is perfect time to do it. So here we've got it. Now I've just got that one there. You'll notice this one has actually reverted back. So this is what the leaf should look like. This one has gone back to just a green leaf with that darker zone in there. So that isn't one that I would take a cutting off, because I want to maintain this lovely golden yellow variegation. So these cuttings here are going to be fine. So to take a cutting is very simple. So you could use your secateurs if you want to, just to trim that down. And then I'm going to use a knife. Now, you could use a very sharp pair of snips if you wanted to, but I prefer to use a sharp knife. And two ways you can do this. The way I do it is to cut onto my thumb, but the other way was just take some of these leaves off first, and you'll find these just snap off very easily. So just a little bit of downward pressure and these leaves peel off. And all I'm going to leave is just a couple of leaves on the top. So we'll take that one off like that. And then any of these little fleshy bits where the leaves were attached to the stem, we call these stipules. We also need to take those off all the way down the stem. So there's none of those on there. So that is essentially the cutting, but now we need to cut it to length. We don't need great big long cuttings. All we need is 2-3 inches at the most. And these little lines on the stem are what we call the nodes. That's where the leaves were attached here. And just below the node is where we get a concentration of hormones that will produce new leaves. So you could cut them down on a chopping block and do that if you wanted to, and I'll do that just to show you it does work. Just a nice clean cut, and we can see there, lovely cut. And that is our cutting. It really is as simple as that. So I'm just going to do a couple more, then I'm going to show you how to insert them into the pots. So we'll just snap the leaves off. Any flower buds that you see, these haven't got them, but you'd also take those off. These little stipules, because they trap the moisture and then that can cause the stem to rot. And then I'm just going to cut that one to about there. That's the leaf joint. So I'm literally just going a millimetre or so underneath. So I'm used to doing this, but if you're not sure, then cut down. So what I'll do now is prepare a few more and then we'll insert them. So there we go, 5 cuttings now that we can root over the winter. Great job to do, of course, if it's a bit cool outside. Pottering in the greenhouse is something I love to do. And one of the things I often do is listen to a podcast. So if you are looking for a podcast, don't forget we do the Pots and Trowels podcast, where every week we talk to guests from the world of horticulture. We answer some of your gardening questions and give you a few jobs to do in the week. So listen out for Pots and Trowels if you haven't already. It's available on all your podcast providers. So here we've got our cuttings now and we need to insert them. So I've got 5 really strong little cuttings there off my main plant. So they're going to give us new plants for next year. So plenty to give to friends. So how do we root them? Well, traditionally, I like to root them in terracotta pots. Now you don't have to use terracotta, and here's some that I did earlier in the week of another old variety called Caroline Schmidt, and this is the way I was taught to do it when I was an apprentice many years ago. The reason we use terracotta pots is because they are porous and they breathe, so it's really difficult to overwater them in them because they drain very well, because the cuttings don't like to be too wet. So if you've got clay or terracotta pots, they are ideal. You can, of course, just use an ordinary plastic pot, something like that, a 9cm pot, and put 3 or 4 cuttings around the edge, but just be careful that you don't overwater. Or the other way you can do it is to do them into individual little pots, either small plastic pots, or these are some little pots here that are made from recycled cardboard, so these will biodegrade and completely rot away. And lots of people do this. And a friend of mine called Helen Bainbridge, who we call the Queen of Pelargoniums because of her prize-winning plants that she's grown, she always does them individually like this, for the simple reason they can, if it's cold and wet, get a disease called black leg, where the base of the stem gets a mould and it rots, and that can then spread to other cuttings if they're in the same pot. So Helen's recommendation is to root them individually like this. So it's your choice. So I'm going to do some of each and see if we get any difference. The compost is really important. You need a very well-drained compost. So I'm using a multi-purpose compost here. And what I've done is I've added into it some sharp grit. I bought it from the garden centre. It's called Alpine Grit. So there's 2 parts of the compost and 1 part grit. And this is really gritty. If I squeeze that, you can hear how gritty that is. So that's going to drain really well. So pot, a bit of compost in there. So we can just fill that and tap it. And then I'm just going to do a couple of pots individual. I will be doing some more as well. I just have to do this on the quiet when Jill's not watching, because then she doesn't know how many I'm propagating. And so using my little dibber, don't push them in because this is a gritty compost, and if you push them in, it's going to scratch them. So just make a hole with the dibber and push them in. So about half the stem is below, and just then lightly firm it. So really, really simple. I don't use any rooting compounds at all. Some people do. I don't think they need it. They root so easily without. So third one in and just firm it in like that. And then a label in saying happy thought. And then these final two here, we'll put these two in. So it's just a little hole, push it in and firm it so it stands upright. And then what we can do is take those across and put them on the bench. Now, where to root them depends on what you've got. I'm going to root these in the greenhouse here. If you haven't got a greenhouse, don't worry. If you've got a bright windowsill, it doesn't need to be full sun. In fact, better not to be in full sun. Put them on there, just put them on a little saucer, and they'll be fine, because that's obviously going to be nice and warm. And then I'm going to give these a drink because these are newly inserted. So it's just a little drink, and I'm actually not going to wet the foliage too much, because the drier you can keep the foliage, the better. So I'm just giving them a water in. That will soak down through that compost. That one's a bit dry at the back. And then I won't really water those again now until that compost starts to dry out. So in the greenhouse here, although I've got no air heat, these are on a heated bench which is set at 20 degrees. So these get that little bit of heat coming up from the soil warming cable, and I will probably drape a bit of fleece over them just to give them that extra little coziness, a bit like a duvet over them. And they will normally root in about 3 weeks time. And as long as you keep them on the dry side and frost free, they'll be perfect. But as I say, if you haven't got a greenhouse, put them in a cool windowsill in the house, they will root. And then what we'll do in the spring is we will pot the individual little rooted cuttings up, on the ones that we'll take out of there, into small pots, grow them on, and then by May next year we'll have lovely strong plants that we can put in larger pots and put them out and enjoy them in the garden over the summer. So if you've got some pelargoniums and they're coming to the end of their season, don't throw them away or put them on the compost bin. Trim them back, take some cuttings, and you can get even more next year for free. Well, thank you for watching Pots and Trowels, and don't forget you can watch all the videos that we've done on YouTube for free, and as I mentioned, also our podcast as well. We'll be back again next week with more gardening tips and advice, so we'll see you then. Bye.